Video games. The thing that's played by thousands upon millions of people till this day, and is probably one of the biggest genres on the internet. Video games as we know today can tie back to communication in multiple ways, from just plotting a victory royale with your friends, or simply trying to prove yourself of not being the imposter, is all different types of communication. Now before I start rambling about how video games became an important factor of communication, I want to just give you a little brief history on video games as a whole, from how it was at the beginning and how it evolved to become the big behemoth it is today, played by millions of people. I'm Mustafa Hamid, and I'm presenting you the history of video games. Video games as we know it today has been around for over 60 years. Yes, starting in 1958 by a guy named William Higginbotham, who is known for creating what is thought to be the first video game, known as Tennis for Two. Tennis for Two was a pretty simple game, and it didn't go too viral since it was first of its kind. Anyways, Tennis for Two was a pretty simple tennis game, and was pretty similar to the classic game known as Pong, made in the 1970s. Quite some time has passed, and computers became a little relevant. While the relevancy of the computers, some scientists decided to make another game known as Space Wars. Space Wars was a small action-packed game where you get to control a little spaceship. During the relevancy of Space Wars, it also brought a new type of game in the form of arcade games. This game is heavily known as Pong. Yes, you heard it, Pong. Pong was the first ever game to become very popular during its time, and most people might consider it to be the first ever video game made, which is wrong. During the hype of Pong, another very legendary game was created known as Maze War. Maze War was the first ever FPS game, or first person shooter, to be created, making it different from all the other video games created at that time. During the 1976, Atari was created, and while with the creation of Atari, a new game was also created, known as Breakout. Breakout took the same physics of Pong and made it where you can break other blocks, which was pretty impressive during this time. 2 years has passed and another game was born. This game took inspiration of Space Wars and turned it more into a modern version, known as Space Invaders. Space Invaders also takes place in space. You just shoot little aliens down. Cool, right? Anyways, another game was created during this time, and it was pretty similar to Space Invaders. This game was called Asteroids, and it also took place in space. Like, bruh, why all these games be taken in space? What's so cool about it? Like, bruh. Anyways, Asteroids was the last game of the 1970s, making us move to the 1980s. Also known as the golden age of video games. The reason on why most people call this the golden age of video games is because one of the most iconic characters was made in this decade, like Mario, Pac-Man, and Zelda. Pac-Man was made in 1980, and it was a game where you get to control a little yellow circle around that ate little tiny circles while trying to avoid these ghost monsters. What made Pac-Man different from all the other games is that it was pretty colorful, which is probably the reason why it was pretty successful. Exactly 1 year later, in 1981, we see the first appearance of Mario in Donkey Kong. Mario back then was only known as Jumpman, since all he could do was jump, and Donkey Kong was actually the villain. So yeah, in 1982, another game was created known as E.T., the Extraterrestrial. This Atari video game actually has a whole full successful movie now, which thinking about it is pretty cool. In 1983, beholds one of the biggest video game crashes of all time, straight up destroying all the video game industries and in America, resulting in the shift of video games in China, where you can see the new plumber boy, Mario Bros. This was the first official Mario video game, and it was a big hit, now making him one of the most iconic video game characters of all time. 2 years later, another game known as Elite was created. This game took visuals and animated them really well, also taking the same trend of being in space. Pretty cool, right? Anyways, in that exact year, another legendary game was born, and it's known mostly as Tetris. Tetris was a pretty simple game. In fact, I'm still wondering till this day how it became popular. All you do in Tetris is place little blocks that fit in little holes, and that's it. That was the whole game. I'm not complaining, but yeah. Anyways, just the year after, Super Mario Bros. Was born. This was a different Mario game, but I believe it was an addition to Mario Bros. A fun fact about this game is that this game is one of the oldest games to set very high sale record. So yeah, the game was huge. In 1986, The Legend of Zelda was born. Another big game from Nintendo, and it was pretty fun. In fact, I did play this game when I was a small kid, and it was pretty fun. This game set a new style of action and adventure in a fantasy world. Anyway, during the 1986 era, a lot of platformer games was born right after Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda. For instance, Metroid, Mega Man, Castlevania, and Metal Gear are all games that have the same platformer game style built into it, taking advantage of the new style of gaming back then. All these games brought a new era into gaming, changing the atmosphere a bit. While the arcade games were coming to an end, and the hype behind the platformer style games were coming into popularity, a new horizon of gaming was coming in the 1990s. But before we enter the 1990s though, there's two games that I want to mention that kickstarted the 1990s with a big bang. Those two games are Final Fantasy and SimCity. SimCity was a game that took society and made it into a game. Most of you guys might know SimCity as The Sims in today's world, but back then, it was simple as placing a couple buildings, and that's it. And don't forget Final Fantasy, because Final Fantasy was one of the most popular game series, managing to last over 2 decades straight and brought more popularity to the RPG style games through the 1990s and later on. Anyways, moving into the 1990s, we can see a big improvement into video games, like 3D style video game experience. This was a big step in the video game economy. These games that turned into a 3D platform are Doom, Star Fox, Super Mario 64, Resident Evil, and Half-Life. All these games are straight up 3D, which is insane. There's probably more 3D games out there that was made in the 1990s, but these games are the games who blew up back then. Of course, this new style of 3D gaming did not stop the popularity of platformer games being made in the 1990s. We see popular games still made in the 1990s that are just 2D still. A good example of this is Sonic the Hedgehog, and remains a popular video game till this day. Sonic himself was pretty popular and is a pretty iconic character in the video game economy. Of course, Sonic the Hedgehog wasn't the only 2D game made in the 1990s. A bunch of other games was made as well, like Shadow of the Beast, Street Fighter, Pokemon Red and Blue, and Grand Theft Auto. Anyways, all of this summarizes the whole decade of the 1990s, the introduction of 3D gaming, and a bunch of other pretty popular games was made in this decade. Now, moving into 2000s. This is where things get spicy, since the topic of this video is communication. During this decade, we can see a bunch of video games using the mic feature. And since we're talking about communication here, this is a pretty big step in the video game economy. Having the ability to talk to other people through a video game around the world is pretty cool if you ask me. And the video game that introduces the mic feature is Metroid Prime Hunters. This was a Nintendo game made back in 2005, and it introduced a new feature that no other game had. The only game that I do remember that had the same microphone feature before this game is known as Alien Front Online. But the microphone used in that game is totally different than the microphone used in Metroid Prime Hunters. Anyways, Metroid Prime Hunters is a first-person action-adventure video game published by Nintendo in 2006. The perspective of this video game is to go around and kill different monsters. This is not the point here. The point is that this game is the first ever video game to have the microphone feature built into it, allowing other players around the world to talk to each other. And since we're talking about communication here, this shows a big example between communication and video games. Of course, a bunch of other games can use communication in different ways without needing a microphone. Let's take the first ever game made as an example, Tennis for Two. Tennis for Two was a 2-player game, only played by 2 players, of course. They both had to communicate with each other to move the ball around. Of course, communication can also be for your opponent. An example of this is Pong. It was also a two-player game, but the person you're communicating with is your opponent. Basically, you can see that communication in video games can be pretty similar. Said from the beginning, just from planning a victory royale with your friends, or simply just having a great time with your friends playing video games is all communication. Video games pretty much connected the whole world together through the internet, allowing players online to talk to each other. So yeah, this is my documentary of video games. I hope you enjoyed. Like, subscribe, yeah, peace. And one more thing about video games and communication. You're probably wondering on how people used video games as a source of communication back then. Video games was made as a source of entertainment, kind of similar to the TV. Before video games were made, though, people used the radio and the TV as a source of communication to know what's going on around the world back then. But when video games were made, people used them as entertainment. People communicated while playing video games, obviously having a great time. And yeah. Bye.